Today, we're going to see how these three things factor into the process of hiring. So today we're going to begin with about 45 minutes here of this, well, 40 minutes now of presentation time, where I'm going to start with presenting you with the most frequent errors that people make in the hiring process. Then we're going to talk about different types of interviews and formats of interviews and how to design some effective interview questions. We will pause at that point and take about 10 minutes of open Q&A to address any questions that come up for you. So again, feel free to go ahead and start recording some of those questions now as I'm teaching in the chat box so that we make most effective use of that time. Then you'll be going into small group dialogue for 20 minutes. When we come out of that, I'm going to do a little more content presentation for about another 15 minutes about how to structure that interview conversation, some conversation about checking references, when and how to do that, and how we avoid unintentional discriminatory practices as we hire. And then we'll save some time again for another Q&A at the end. So the 10 most common hiring mistakes that people make. Number one is a lack of clarity about what they're looking for. So many times people begin with a generalized sense of need. Okay, we just need help here. We know we need someone to work in this general area of children's ministry, but we don't really stop to think through all of the parameters of exactly what we want that person to do. Oftentimes telling ourselves, what I really need to do is to find the right person, and then they're going to come in and tell us what this job needs to be about. And that's a backward thinking that oftentimes gets us into trouble. We don't have to know how to do the job. And it's true that an individual coming in that we hire is going to shape the role in some meaningful ways. But if we don't have some clarity about the specific kinds of things that we want children's ministry to look like in our context, that's going to be one of the things that gets us into trouble. So second biggest problem is inadequate interview preparation. The notion that this is just a conversation, and when the person gets here, I'm just going to intuitively spend some time with them and figure out what to talk to them about in that time. By the end of today, I hope that what you see is the power in having clarity about a process and carefully designed questions that every candidate for the position is expected to answer. Which leads us to the problem number 3, a poor selection of interview questions. One of the things that gets us into trouble in terms of discriminatory practices or in terms of bad hire is not being really thoughtful about what kinds of questions we need to get at different parts or attributes of the process. Number 4 is our impulse to be too quick to hire. And sometimes this grows out of our sense of frustration that we just need help. Sometimes it grows out of a sense of this appears to be the perfect candidate, and if we don't move quickly, we're going to lose them, or they've told us that they're considering another job, so we want to really rush them through this process. And many of those impulse decisions are fraught with or end up being bad hires long term. So taking the time to work the process that we'll talk about today to bring great intentionality to it not only elevates the importance of the job in the mind of the candidate. Wow, they've really thought this through. They're really being careful about what they're doing. Oftentimes, if we just stay in open communication with the candidate and they see that we're being very professional in our process, that will be enough to hook them in to want to stay with us while we run our process well. Number 5 is called the halo effect. Now, what is the halo effect? This is probably one of the more frequent things I run into as I talk with people all the time. The halo effect is what happens when I find one attribute of the person that I'm intrigued by, and that begins to color all of the rest of how I see this candidate. So let's imagine that I'm hiring someone for youth ministry, and I'm talking to a young male candidate who comes in, and as I'm talking to him, he brings in his guitar. And he pulls out the guitar partway through the interview and begins strumming it, and actually is composing a song on site about the moment that we're in. And I find it charming, I find it intriguing, and I can imagine that our students are going to love this guy because of this kind of charismatic effect he has with his guitar. So that begins to color everything else about this candidate. And in fact, when I take this candidate along to the next interviewer, I tell the next interviewer, make sure that he plays the guitar for you so that I'm setting up the next person to be lulled by the same halo effect. Or another example might be I find out 10 minutes into the interview that this candidate has a German Shepherd, and I love German Shepherds, and I can't imagine anyone who doesn't love a German Shepherd being a bad person. This person must be right for us, right? And so we don't stop to consider things like the guitar playing youth director candidate has no ability to work with parents. And we never found that out in the interview process because we were so captured by one aspect of their candidacy. Mistake number 6, we hire people who are just like us. And this tends to happen not so much in the essential functions. We know we need to find someone who has a skill set that's not like us. But when it gets around to behavioral attributes, temperament types, Enneagram type, we resonate with people who are like us. And this often comes out in conversational patterns, right? I just like this person. I just really connected with them. Well, the fact that you really connect with someone is not an indication that they should be on your staff team. Oftentimes, the people we need to be hiring are people who are not at all like us, who put us a little bit maybe on an edge. Not that we can't work with them, but that we want people who think very differently than we do. Problem number 7, setting unrealistic standards. This tends to not happen so much when we're feeling desperate, but when we enter markets where there is a flood of candidates, and this may very well be happening to a lot of us as we begin to come out of the pandemic situation, if unemployment remains high, that there may be pools of candidates that are pretty deep on the other side of this thing. So we begin setting really unrealistic standards. So I'm looking for this children's ministry coordinator that's largely going to be about purchasing curriculum and coordinating volunteers. And I suddenly find myself with a pool of candidates that includes someone with a PhD in childhood education. The fact that someone that I'm looking at people who have the highest credentials possible in their field is not necessarily a good match for my position. I need to be realistic about what this role really is and what kind of skill sets are really required for this specific role. I think another problem, number 8, is when we use only one interviewer in our interview process. There are very few roles that I can imagine we would hire for in a congregational context where we wouldn't want more than one person's opinion. Perhaps something very part-time, very tangential to the ministry of the congregation, maybe somebody who's doing caretaking of the grounds outside of the church building a couple of times a week for a few hours, maybe that person. But just about every other kind of role, I'm going to want more than my perspective. And how many more perspectives I want and how many more instances of interviews I want is going to depend on what the role and the position is and the level of complexity of what's required there. We'll be talking about that more later when we talk about the interview process and how you design one. So what goes along with that is issue number 10, having an unstructured interview process where we know we're hiring someone and we're just kind of going along with this step by step, and we haven't really imagined in our mind's eye how the process is going to play out from start to finish. How involved is this going to be? How long is it going to take? Who's going to talk to this person? Which people are going to ask which kinds of interview questions? It's a mistake to not structure the larger process. And after today, my hope is that you'll be able to do that. And then the 10th big issue is not checking references or checking references too late. And I'll be saying more about that later. So how do we go about avoiding these mistakes? How do we make sure that we're conducting a process that overcomes a lot of these pitfalls? It begins with clearly defining what it is that you are looking for. And now that we're in week 5 of this course, you actually have many of the skills that it takes to clearly define what the position is. You're going to design a job description, right? Number 2, you have to select the appropriate interview medium. How do I talk to this person? Which is a little challenging in the era of COVID, but we'll visit that. We're going to take a look at how you select the format of an interview in terms of the generic type of interview structure that you choose, how you design effective interview questions, how you structure that whole conversation, and the process of reference checking. So having this clearly defined process in your mind and making choices commensurate with what you're trying to do is kind of the whole point. And then how do you avoid unintentional discrimination throughout that whole process? And that's the focus of the rest of our conversation today. But as we go through this, I want you to remember one key thing, that your goal here is to hire the person who is the best fit for this position. You're not trying to find the candidate who interviews the best. Some people interview really well and can't do the job. Other people are terrible interviewers and have the capacity to do the job quite well. So the process we design has to help us overcome those two biases, right? To help people who are not good interviewers perform more authentically so we can figure out what they actually know, and to kind of wade through the distraction of someone who might be very charismatic in an interview process, but actually not have the skills to do the job. We're not trying to find the most qualified person we can in the area of ministry that we have available to us. We are trying to find the person who is the best fit for this particular role that we have available, with the boundaries of that role clearly in our mind and how that role has to fit inside of an organization. So when we begin with step 1, defining what it is that we are looking for, we come back to these same terms that we've been talking about, the essential functions and the core competencies. If I don't know what those essential functions and core competencies are, I'm not going to be able to do run an effective interview process. I also need to be able to define what kind of an experience level that I have in mind for this individual. So I may know that I'm hiring a bookkeeper and that they have to do things like reconcile accounts and manage transactions and handle updating congregational records and writing checks and everything that a good bookkeeper needs to be able to do. But I also want to know something about the experience level that I'm seeking in terms of the individual's ability to act autonomously, how much trained experience, how much lived experience I think they need to bring into the role in order to function effectively at the level of performance that we're considering. Once I have clarity about the expectations, then I can select my interview medium. I can decide whether I'm going to be phone screening initially, doing video interviews, doing an in-person interview with just one person, doing in-person interviews with sequential interviewers, doing group interviews where the individual has to come in and talk to a whole group of us, whether we're going to gather over a meal, or whether we're actually going to do something where we have the person perform a part of the task while we observe. So this is most easy to imagine in the case of, for example, a choir director that we're hiring, that we may ask to come in and work with the choir one evening while several people observe that interaction, and we get feedback from the choir on what that felt like to work with that individual. But even other kinds of roles, for example, like perhaps we're hiring a maintenance worker, and we're not going to sit and watch them clean a room, but we might bring them into a room that's looking kind of disheveled and not ready for a meeting. And we might say to them, Tell me what has to happen in this room before it's ready for a meeting to take place here this evening, and to see what they notice and what they pay attention to, and what they seem to ignore. Okay, so all of these mediums have different advantages. A phone screen is easy, it's concise, it can focus my energy down just to the skill of listening. I don't have to worry about, and the candidate doesn't have to worry about their appearance yet. A phone screen might be great for just talking with someone about an application that they submitted. But then the video interview layers in on top of that, obviously, the ability to see how this person carries themselves, how they prepare themselves for the interview. There's lots of things that are distracting in a video interview that I might not want to be bothered with in a first conversation. Some of these interview techniques are not available to us right now while we're in the midst of pandemic. I've seen people hire candidates fully without doing any in-person meetings right now. It's going to be interesting on the other side of things to see how long those employees, how long-term, how those employees work out with us. But whether or not you choose to use a group interview or someone has to come in and talk to a whole room full of lay leaders, should I do that? Well, the answer depends on whether or not the person in their role needs to do that, right? So I don't want to set up a group interview where someone who is cleaning the building has to come in and talk with the heads of 6 committee chairs in a group context, because that does not replicate anything that this employee is going to have to do long-term, right? So I want the medium I choose and the interview process that I design to reflect the skill base of what I'm trying to hire for. We'll be saying more about this as we move along. In addition to understanding that I have different medium available to me to conduct interviews, I also have different formats of interviews. So let's talk about these. Some of these we use quite frequently and others not so much. The traditional interview form is the kind of interview that I conduct with someone who has sent me a resume or completed an application of some kind. And I'm using that resume or that application form as a way to call out additional information on the employee. So in this particular interview format, in some ways, the employee is kind of driving the show by what they have chosen to present to me in written form. I'm going to ask them questions about that. Tell me about this. Well, I noticed there's a gap of employment here. What was happening for you in that time period? Why did you pursue that course of study? That's a long time to be in one job. Tell me about what you learned there. Okay, so when I'm taking what they give me and I'm forming questions out of that and using the format that they've given me to invite them to show their best self to me, and to possibly identify some things where their story doesn't quite hold up. Now, this traditional interview format is oftentimes very effective in the very first stages of interviewing. When we have, let's say we have a whole set of applications or resumes that have come in for a particular position, and we're just trying to figure out who should actually be in the candidate pool. And we want a first interview where we identify people who seem to match up with the skills and abilities we're looking for and don't seem to present any major problems that are glaring glitches in terms of their match for the position. The traditional interview format can be very effective for that, for putting together that first pool. The problem, of course, with the traditional interview is it puts a really heavy reliance on what the candidate has chosen to tell me about themselves, right? It doesn't really allow me to kind of get into some of the edges of where their portrayal of who they are may not hold up well relative to the position that I need them to perform. But it has its place. Now, the situational interview goes beyond the basics of your history and your past. In the situational interview, I set up scenarios, okay? If I'm hiring for a youth minister or a youth director, I might ask a question like, tell me what you would do if you arrive at the building to find that the youth are already there and they are creating mayhem and running around the building. What would you do first? Or what would you do if you had put a lot of time and energy into organizing a mission trip, and in the time leading up to the departure of the trip, a group of parents began to feel uneasy that this isn't right or safe for their children to participate in? What would you do next? Okay, so I create a hypothetical situation. And oftentimes the hypothetical situation that I create is based on our own lived experience, things that we've actually run into issues with in the past. And we'd like to see how the person thinks their way through the problem. What the situational interview is really good at is testing the logic of an individual, testing some of their problem-solving skills. How would they think their way through this? How would they sequence a response? Are the things that they're talking about appropriate for the context that I set up? The downfall of the situational interview is that it doesn't allow me to determine if, in fact, the person would do the thing that they're saying they would do. So if I'm trying to find out if someone is comfortable handling conflict, and I ask them to tell me what they would do in a particular situation, they may have all kinds of head knowledge about what the right response would be. But in the real world, they would actually never engage those responses because they are so conflict avoidant, they would do the opposite of what they said. So the fact that an individual knows how to tell which door to pick, which way to move forward, doesn't mean they would actually engage that action in real life. So that's one of the flaws of the situational interview. The case study interview is one, frankly, that we don't use very often in congregational circles, but it is available to us. It has a lot of the same features of the situational interview. In the case study interview, typically I would put something down in writing. I would have them either listen to a scenario or read through a full scenario. The advantage of using a case study over the situational is that the situational sets up a really easy issue for someone to work through. Okay, tell me what would happen if this happened. Okay, in a case study, I would give them something much more nuanced. If you think back to the case study we did in week 1 of our course, there was something about Mary, about the employee who was supposed to be working in education and kept kind of recreating her own job description and her own set of responsibilities and was never held accountable. And we kept redesigning everyone else's jobs around Mary. The case study allows me to set up something that's more complex and nuanced, to allow the person to read through it, to think about it for a while, for a few minutes, and then to talk to us about how they would diagnose that case and what they would do about it. Now, the power of the case study, because it's more complex and more nuanced, it allows me to really pay attention to what did the person attend to and all that was on the page. What did they zero in on? What did they seem to gloss over? Were they able to get at the heart of the matter? Were they able to distinguish the more critical from the less critical? And did they have a course of action that seemed to make sense? Was there a savviness, an organizational savviness about how they came at the problem? The case study has the same downfalls that the situational interview has. Because the situational interview, I don't really know what the person would do. Same thing in the case study. An individual could really do well analytically on paper, but in fact not engage any of those solutions in the real world. So this then brings us to a form of interviewing called the behavioral-based interview. And I imagine that many of you have dabbled with or experienced a behavioral-based interview, even if you don't know it by that name, okay? In the behavioral-based interview, the candidate demonstrates their competence by providing me with specific examples of how they handled similar situations in the past. So the hallmark of this interview is it almost always begins with questions along the lines of, tell me about a time when you demonstrated this. Okay. Now, some people will say, isn't that the same thing as the situational interview? No, it's different, because instead of me providing an abstract of a scenario that the candidate has to imagine in their head, I ask the candidate to provide me an example of a time in their life when they demonstrated the competency or the function that I want them to demonstrate in the future. And the power of the behavioral-based interview is that past performance is usually the best predictor of future success. So someone who has been in a circumstance in the past and figured out and learned something from that circumstance, and they can reflect on that and show me how they did it then and how they would do it moving forward, is the key for why this is a powerful form of interview. Okay. It also has its drawbacks. It's time consuming to do. Not everyone responds to behavioral-based interviewing well, but I want to spend some time with you unpacking it so that you know how to do it more effectively, and so that you can figure out where it fits for you in the context of interviewing. So we'll talk a little bit about how the questions are structured, and then talk about where it works best in an interview process. So when you get into behavioral-based interviewing questions, they always follow this kind of prescribed format. There's a challenger situation that you set up, so that in words, you describe what the competency is or what the skill is that you're looking to be demonstrated. Okay. It's asking the individual to reflect on action they took in a specific circumstance from their own history. And then it invites them to reflect on the results that they experienced, what they learned from that, and how they adapted their behavior moving forward. And that's a much richer set of responses than just the paper response of, well, I would just do this if faced with that circumstance. So one of the powers of behavioral-based interviewing is it's really difficult for an individual to fake their way through it. If an individual begins to imagine a response that's not authentic or true, what often happens to them is they get tricked up by their own logic as they go through that. They get kind of trapped into a corner. So if they're not reflecting on something authentic, it will become apparent, which is another one of the powers of this particular kind of questioning. So the way that the interviewing works is that you begin by saying, this is the competency I want the candidate to discuss. Then you ask them to describe how they behaved in a real situation when that competency was important. Okay, and the second part, the critical part of point number 2, is your ability to define what you mean by that competency, right? So you can't just throw a label at them. You have to unpack that label. You have to define, what do I mean by, if it's important to me that someone shows that they're collaborative, what do I mean by that? What is it I actually want their story to demonstrate? Sometimes I can just throw the label out there because I'm curious as to what they think collaboration is. But if I'm trying to get at a specific definition of what that word means to me, then I define it in the question itself. I ask an initial question that they then respond to with an example from their own past or their own life. And then I follow up with more detailed probing questions so that the candidate can't just theorize, fabricate, or generalize their answers. They have to be talking about something that was real to them, or it won't stand up to the follow-up probes. Then my job as the candidate is responding is note-taking. Note-taking is the thing that allows me to not jump to snap conclusions. So one of the problems that many of us have when we go through an interview process with a bunch of candidates is that we pretty much decide in the first 3 minutes of the interview whether we think they're the candidate or not. Our mind wants to reach closure on that. So in the first couple of minutes, we go ahead and decide, I think this person's really got something, or, oh, this person is not impressive at all. And then the whole rest of the interview for us is designed to try and reinforce or disprove the conclusion we've already drawn. What we want to do as interviewers is to override our tendency to reach that snap decision. And one of the ways that we can do that is through note taking. If I force myself to take notes, it keeps me in a deeply attending listening mode with this candidate, so that I kind of hijack my brain to not be able to do that conclusion reaching until later. Right now, my job is to listen, to ask good questions, and to take good notes. And then later I can get to a decision that I choose to make about that. So in designing these behavioral-based questions, I have to get clear about my definition of the competency, and then I have to formulate a question that is neither too broad but also not too specific. Tell me about a time when you had to collaborate is actually a little too broad. It doesn't give enough direction about what's important to me in collaboration or what I mean by that. Tell me about a time when you were working with other members of the staff team and they wanted to do one thing and you wanted to do another thing, and then they voted you out of the room. Okay, when I start adding in too many specific components into the question, I narrow it in so much that a lot of people can't even answer the question, or it loses track of the learning component. What I want to accomplish with behavioral-based questions, I don't want to necessarily find someone who does a great job with giving me all positive answers of how great they were. I actually am more invigorated by people who share instances when they didn't do the best thing, when they made a wrong decision. And then I listen to them unpack what they learned through that. To me, that's a much more exciting candidate. And I will often communicate that to people when I go into behavioral-based interviewing. I'm not just looking for all your best moments. Feel free to share a time that was less stellar for you. And tell me what you learned out of that. So here's some sample questions just so that you can see what I'm talking about. If the competency that I'm trying to get at is adaptability and flexibility, kind of a more general question that's still a pretty effective question, I could say, describe a time when you had to adjust to a change over which you had no control. Notice in that first question that what I'm doing is I'm defining what I think adaptability and flexibility is, okay? Or I can say, tell me about a time when you had to think on your feet to extricate yourself from a difficult situation. So adaptability and flexibility has a lot of different components to it. In the formulation of my question, I am helping the candidates understand what I think that term means and what's important to it for me. If I was trying to get a collaboration, I might say, tell me about a project you worked on that involved people from many different areas of the organization. What did you do to make that project successful? Or what did you do when you were faced with problems you can't solve within your unit or team? And share an example. So that second question, I'm defining for them an aspect of collaboration I want them to talk about. And then I'm asking them, go into your own memory bank and explore a time when you had to grapple with that. Now, one of the challenges of working with these behavioral-based questions is that I have to ask questions that allow a full pool of candidates to respond to. Maybe I'm hiring a children's coordinator, but I'm open to hiring someone who doesn't have previous experience in a congregation. So my question can't be so specific to my context that someone who doesn't already have that background, they can't answer the question. But just about everybody has something in their life relative to collaboration that they could talk about. Even if they never did this kind of ministry role before, they had some experience. Even if this is their first working experience, they have some experience from their educational background, from their family situation, where collaboration became an important thing. And I want to be able to ask my questions in a way that the full pool of candidates that I'm talking to will be able to respond. If the competency is decision-making, I could ask, describe a situation in which you had to make a decision without having all the information you needed. How then did you proceed? Or tell me about a decision that you made that turned out badly And in hindsight, what would you have done differently if what I'm trying to figure out is their resilience in decision making and their capacity to correct when errors have been made? So there can be multiple questions for a particular competency. Now, one of the things I hope that you're hearing as we talk about this is that behavioral-based interview questions are really good for getting at core competencies. Some of the other interview forms, like the traditional interview form, may be better suited to getting at whether or not they have the experience to do the essential functions of the task. But when it comes to core competencies, and my trying to assess and determine whether or not the person has within them the qualities and the attributes and the skills to engage in this particular competency, the best predictor of whether they have that is their own past experience, their own past stories. So behavioral-based interviewing is particularly well suited for trying to get at core competencies. Okay, we're going to stop here and take some time for questions that this has prompted for you, either questions about interviewing or questions from earlier in the course that are still unresolved for you that this has provoked today. I will open the floor up and see what emerges here. Kathleen, if you want to begin us with any questions you see emerging.
Nothing so far.
Okay. So we're just giving people a chance to grapple with what they're learning here. For some people, this may feel like, okay, I think I've known a lot of this stuff.
Here we go. So were you suggesting an interview format for initial call and then behavioral in round 2? So
yeah, so that often has been a pattern that I've used. So when I'm faced with a whole pool of candidates and I'm trying to determine which of these candidates should really go into my final pool, that traditional interview form can be really, I think, really effective for that. And so round 1, I might use mostly that with a couple of behavioral-based questions. But the further along I get into the interview process where I'm really trying to hone in on some of those competencies, I would use more and more behavioral-based interviewing. You don't have to do all one kind or the other. We can blend them together for whatever is appropriate. I do think it's important in your first round of putting together a pool of candidates that you get yourself out of the mindset of saying, which of these people is going to be my candidate? The best thing that you can do is to say, which of these people should continue on in conversation with us about who is the best candidate? I'm sure most of you have participated in a process where you were hiring someone and you narrowed down a pool too quickly and then came to understand you didn't really have any candidates in that initial pool and you had to go back. And then you had to overcome that sense of, oh my gosh, we kind of failed that first round, or there just aren't good people out there. A lot of time what happens to us is we narrow our pool too quickly by making decisions too quickly about who has the skills and who doesn't. There are some people who don't present really great in the first couple rounds of interviews that we need to keep in the pool, because as we go further in and deeper, we find in fact that they are better candidates than some of the flashier people we talked to early on.
That's great. And follow up to that though is, what if you don't have any applicants who meet requirements for the job?
Unfortunately, in the world of congregations, that seems to happen a lot, right? So one of the first things I have to ask myself is whether or not the position was priced right. Are we underpaying and that's why we're not getting quality applicants? Or have we not put the word out there in the right places? Whatever form of advertising you did to come up with your pool of candidates, you may not have cast a wide enough net. I would suggest that in most of the clients I've worked with, it comes down to more an issue of cost, right? Like we just are, we're not offering a high enough salary base for what it is we're talking about. Or maybe you haven't even gotten to the point yet where you're talking about salary and you still haven't gotten a wide enough pool. Sometimes it could be because we're asking for something part-time that really needs to be full-time. And then, when we're faced with that, because that's real world, then we have to decide to what extent are we willing to compromise on some of what we think we're looking for to get a body in here to do some of the job. And if that's the case, again, I invite you to come back to the job description to say, are we being, if we hire this person, then are we being realistic about what the job description is, or do we need to rethink that in some way?
Yeah.
Sometimes hiring an unqualified person is worse than not hiring. I would say oftentimes that's the case. Where I would encourage people to just leave that job open for a little while until you learn more about it, until you can figure out how to recraft it into something that seems more like it will generate a better pool of candidates, but to not just say, oh, well, this is the best we have, so I'll hire these people. I can't tell you how many conversations I have in any given month with pastors who say, I just basically have staff members who can't do what I need them to do. They just don't have the skill sets to do it. We have a lot of that in our congregations. We need to stop doing that.
Yeah. And one question in terms of the legalities of an interview process and getting to the right candidate, do you ask the same questions of every candidate, or can you tweak them a bit to fit the situation of each person with whom you're speaking?
I think that's a both and, yes and no, right? So fundamentally, you want to have the same interview process for all of your candidates, because that is how you overcome bias, right? If what I do is I think of questions on the spot based on who walks into my office and presents himself to me, then I'm already down a rabbit hole that might get me into trouble. But if I have the same fundamental set of questions, I'm going to ask everybody. But then, of course, if someone says something that is a flag to me, and I'm going to follow up on that, or there's something unique about this person's background I want to ask them about, I can do that. I will say more later in our conversation about some of the ways we get into trouble there. But by and large, I think a pre-designed set of questions for every candidate is the better way to go.
And you were talking about cost and salary. At what point in the process do you recommend that become a part of the conversation?
Boy, that's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before.
Thank Ledley.
Yeah. Okay, Ledley. I think that communicating, and I'd be interested too in your take on this one, Kathleen, after I bumble my way around in this. But, I think when we first post a position, ideally, if we have a salary range attached to it that we can communicate, it helps us to get a better pool of candidates. But then to not actually get specific about what we're offering that individual until well into the interview, right? So in an idealized world, you have a position and you'll say there's a salary range attached to this job, and the actual salary someone is going to get paid is going to depend on what experience and qualifications they bring into the job, so that when you're talking to a candidate that they're not you're not talking to somebody that's just so far out of the range that they're not going to be interested. But you don't want to start to get into, and how much will I get paid for this job? But what would you say, Kathleen?
A couple of things that we've done, but in part because we're in such a competitive environment in DC, is that we'll start with salary commensurate with experience. And then as we moved into a narrowed pool, we'll do a salary check-in and see if our salary range is
realistic,
is compatible with what they're thinking.
Yeah.
And that's, that fits our environment in many cases. One of the things that we find is that we sometimes have underqualified, not completely but underqualified. And if we post a range, the expectation is that you come in at the top of the range. And that's not commensurate with what that person is bringing to the job.
Thank you. Well, and one of the things that I really like in what you just lifted up too is how regional some of this stuff is.
Yeah.
You know, I've had a lot of clients in the DC area, and I do know that the labor market there seems to operate pretty differently than in a lot of the other parts, you know, same in New York and same out in California, right?
Yeah.
It's just very different hiring people in some key metropolitan areas than it is hiring somebody in Des Moines, Iowa, right? In terms of the predictability of the labor market, what you can say about that stuff.
Yeah. Okay, a few more questions. Henry McQueen, you mentioned the halo effect in terms of positive highlight. What about a negative aspect?
Yeah. Halo effect
One that could be a deal breaker.
Yeah. You know, so something flags me that the employee says, and my experience with somebody previous to that was this person who had that attribute was terrible at this job. You know, so this person talked about the fact that they went away to boarding school. And for me, that's like, oh, people who go to boarding school are like this. Right? And I have negative connotations about that. So that colors everything and turns into something that the person has to overcome. We have to be equally careful about that. Yeah. But I want to distinguish that from a circumstance in which somebody does say something that actually is a deal breaker, right? You know, well, gosh, I was let go from my previous position under the suspicion that I had an inappropriate relationship with one of the students on my team. You know, that's not halo effect. That's a disqualifier. Right. As I research that and find out, in fact, if that was the situation, the real situation here. Yeah.
Great. A couple more. While we're on salary, would you discuss the process of setting salary for different roles in the congregation?
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to do that because, but I'll let you answer this also, Kathleen, because you might feel comfortable saying more about this than I could. Because my work is done nationally, and I find that this is so different in different regions of the country.
Right.
But many denominations and middle judicatory bodies do have research on this stuff that you can tap into, right? So the first thing I would go to is salary surveys. And there's organizations independent of your denomination that do this, where you can pay to find out how much does a position like this in my area of the country pay typically. Yep. But Kathleen, what do you all have as a resource for people on that or anything?
It's very similar. I mean, Society for Human Resource Management you have to really dive pretty deeply into theirs to find compatible positions. If you've worked with a temp agency, like we've used Ronstadt, but they do an annual salary survey, so you can use salary surveys. There are some church publications that we publish clergy data in our journal, and so sometimes that's helpful in finding peer for clergy positions. But it's really salary survey data, and then talking with peers in other denominations is actually a really good way to find out our marketplace.
Yeah, like in your local context.
In our local context.
And what are the Methodists paying over there? And
right.
I know that the Church Network used to be the National Association for Church Business Administrators. They have a national salary base. I don't know how good it is, but I do know people have used that. But again, you have to pay for all of these, right? Where you enter your data and as much as you know about the physician, and they tell you what they know about the region that you're in. But as Kathleen is saying, even if you get region data, sometimes that's even out of whack for your very local market, right?
Yep.
You know, so I'm downtown DC, and this part of the city is going to be different than, you know,
even some of our rural counties.
Yeah,
substantial difference.
exactly.
Yeah. So I think if you can use your free network, the network of your peers, that's going to save you a lot of potentially money and certainly time.
Yeah.
Couple more questions before we go to break.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about that, and then we'll take these other questions. Researching salary ranges is great work to give your personnel committee if you have one. If
Very
you have
good
one and
point.
they're healthy, you know, because you can go down a lot of rabbit holes trying to research salary ranges.
Yeah.
And that is great work for the laity of the congregation to say, you all go research this and figure out, because that is part of their job, is to figure out what part of our budget are we allocating to salary related expenses? What is our policy about where we want to be relative to equitable pay ranges in our area? And the laity should really be grappling with those questions.
Thank you. Very, very important point. Couple more. While you're on, what process to set? So we've talked about setting fair salaries, and that's doing some research, using your personnel committee. Is it a wise practice not to hire the best candidate because they are a member of the congregation?
Well, this gets us back to our week 1 conversation about employment and covenant, doesn't it? So, so I think before you begin a hiring process, before you even put together a pool of candidates, you need to grapple with the question of, will we consider people who are members of the congregation? And if we allow people to enter in as candidates into a pool and they're members of the congregation, I think that's the moment in time to have the conversation with those people to say, you do realize that once you even put your name into a pool, you're changing your relationship with the congregation, right? It's a different kind of relationship you will enter into. Are you sure you want to do that? I do think we also have to be careful about saying sometimes we're not generically opposed to a member coming on the staff team, but this particular person, it's going to be a problem because of their boundaries, because how we've seen them operate. And so I think then it may be appropriate to say to someone or to eliminate someone from the pool, because you know that they, you know, for this person, there's going to be maybe another way to think about it is there's another core competency in a job for a person crossing over from membership into employment. And can we talk with them about what that is? And some people will actually be eliminated from the process because we don't think they have that skill set. We don't think they're going to be boundaried enough, that they're going to, you know, that they've shown us evidence in the past that they do triangulated communication with members of the congregation, that's going to be problematic. So I would never just out of hand reject someone unless you had a clear policy about that, but to be really clear about what does it take to cross over that and can this person do that? Should be part of your process. Yeah.
And if the person ends employment, and especially if it's involuntary, should that person relinquish their membership in the parish?
We'll talk about that next week.
Okay. All right.
That's next week.
Getting ahead. All right. So a couple more questions. How does the candidate's personal social media account play into the process?
Well, these days it does, right?
Yeah.
You know, people have put themselves out there in the world, and I think it would be naive of us to not, if we have the opportunity to check someone's social media presence, if we wouldn't take advantage of that. Yeah. In some particular roles, it's going to be more of an issue than in others. Like if I'm hiring a children's minister or a youth minister or a youth director, I'm going to expect that they're going to do a lot of their ministry on social media. And so I would make that a very intentional part of my process. What is it that they put out there in the world? For other positions, it might not be as critical, but I'd still take a look. I would always take a look.
Great. Okay. Is there an annual church compensation guide that takes into consideration regional church budget, full-time, part-time, that we recommend? There is, in the Episcopal Church, there is for clergy.
Okay. Well, and the church network one that I'm aware of, that does that.
Yeah.
I don't,
And
I stopped short of recommending it because I haven't personally worked with it. So I don't know how good it is, but I know of it and I know of people who use it.
I think Church Finance out of Christianity Today
Yes, they do that.
also does
Yeah.
that includes both lay and clergy positions. And again, it's one that you do have to buy, but they do an annual salary survey and it's available.
And it's geared towards regional differences. Yeah. Okay.
And how about how do you see through what appears to be an attractive candidate who is only attractive because another church is trying to get rid of that employee who was destructive to the system?
Why would they, maybe that person needs to talk to me. Why would they be considered an attractive candidate?
Joshua,
you
Hey.
want to come on?
Hi there.
Yeah.
So I have unfortunately seen this happen several times where the church knows that the only way to get rid of the person from their church is to find another church for them. Has anyone else encountered this?
Yes, I've encountered this too. Isn't it a sick system we're part of that we do that?
Yes, but it really seems to happen like quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the way that we prevent that from happening is through our interview process, the care of structuring a really good interview process, and then reference checks, which we're going to talk about after our small group work. I think reference checks help a little bit with how people talk to us during that. But yeah, I would love for all of us to covenant together here today to not do that as a practice ourselves. Let's not do that to one another or our brothers and sisters in other denominations and faith traditions. Let's not pass along problematic people just to try and get them out of our problem area. But we're going to talk about reference checks after we come back from our small group work. So we'll talk more about that, Joshua. Thanks for bringing that up. That is a real thing. You're right.
and then our last one is from Sarah Oderstall, and it's actually a good reminder and question. Sarah? It was, I don't know, she may not be on right now.
No, I'm here. I just
okay. Hi, Sarah.
had to figure out how to unmute. It was a ways away from me. No, my comment was just when your employees decide to become church members, it's really important to sit down with them and talk about how they're not going to be treated in the same way that other just regular old church members are going to be treated. They're always going to be asked to make photocopies on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. And their primary relationship with the church is going to always be their employment relationship.
Right.
That's always going to be primary over their membership relationship. So it works both ways, right? Yeah. If somebody's a member and they're coming in, we have to have that conversation. If they're on the staff team and decide they're going to become members, people carry a lot of unstated assumptions in their head about what they're signing on for when they make those decisions. And you're absolutely right, Sarah, just to bring great intentionality into the conversation about what exactly are you deciding here? So, and the limitations of that. Okay, Kathleen, is it okay if I move us on to our small group?
We're ready.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to share my screen once again to get us over to what the small group task is. So we're going to stick with behavioral-based interviewing as a skill that many of you are needing to hone a little bit better. So in this small group, we're setting up kind of like a mini mini case study that you're going to work on together. Actually, it's more like a situational challenge. Okay, I want you to imagine that you are getting ready to hire a maintenance worker in your congregation, and that this person is basically going to be doing custodial work for you, but they're also expected to do room setups and some readiness of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. Okay, so they're going to be a person who has to interact with some other individuals in the church. They're not just going to work kind of in the hidden corners quietly on their own. They have to interact with church members around room setups and getting the building ready and some hospitality of the building. Okay, so that's the basic position that you're hiring for. And I'm going to go ahead and say that you've already prepared a job description and you've identified a whole set of core competencies, but 3 of these core competencies that you've identified are a good attention to detail, a sense of aesthetic awareness, and a sense of initiative. And all 3 of those are further defined on page 59 in your workbook, okay, in that bank of core competencies. So you can go to page 59 and read about these 3 things: attention to detail, aesthetic awareness, and initiative. Your conversation in your small group, and we're going to put you together in groups of about 4 people, is we want you to design 2 or 3 behavioral-based interview questions for each of those competencies. Okay, so you're not going to have to report these out. So just spend a little time on each one of these competencies and brainstorm together. What are some of the ways that we might write a behavioral-based question to get at this? Now, what I'm going to recommend when you get into your small groups and you say hi to one another, that you just take some quiet time in your small group. You know, maybe 4 or 5 minutes of quiet time for everybody to work on their own at crafting a question in each of these areas, and then start sharing those and help one another to sharpen the questions, okay? Because the best way to figure out if the question is good is for somebody else to try and imagine answering it. If nobody in your group can answer that question, it's not a good behavioral-based interview question, okay? So that's the task of the group. And I believe that Jennifer was going to drop those in to our chat box so that you have access to those questions. Yep, there it is. It's showing up over on the chat. And then Peter's going to send you on out, and we'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Okay, I'm going to go back into sharing my screen, and there's just a few more concepts that we want to go through here together, and then we'll go back into Q&A. So again, I invite you, as if there are still some questions that were lingering from your small groups, your time in your small groups, take a moment now while you're listening to go ahead and get those in the chat box so that when we get to Q&A, we can remember what those were and we can get ourselves queued up in those right away. Okay, so one question that often comes up when we talk about behavioral-based interviewing, everybody recognizes this is a different way of interviewing for some people, and it's a little tricky. So should we provide the questions to candidates in advance of the interview? And the answer to that is no. And the reason the answer is no is because the power of behavioral-based interviewing is getting at authenticity. It's getting at what is real. What did the person actually experience? What do they actually know how to do? And if you send out the questions in advance, you are going to get rehearsed answers, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of doing behavioral-based interviewing in the first place, right? So there are things that you can do to help a candidate who may be struggling. So the first thing that I would always do is to tell people up front that we're going to be doing this different kind of interviewing called behavioral-based interviewing. If you know that you're going to do a behavioral-based driven process, you can even send that out to people ahead of time and say, we're going to be asking you to draw on experiences from prior work engagements or other parts of your life to illustrate what's important in this job. So just be thinking about, some of your past experiences, because if you just get people just something that prompts their thinking, they'll be better at this. If they've been thinking more about where they've come from and some of the experiences that they've had, that will help. I think it also helps a lot just to give people permission to be silent. So I oftentimes will just let people know this is one kind of interview where it's okay for you to just take some quiet time to think about what I'm asking. It's also okay for you to not have an answer right now. So if nothing comes to mind, you can just say to me, there's nothing coming to mind. In all likelihood, as we go along through the interview, other things are going to pop up for them. They're going to, present themselves in their memory more prominently. They can always come back to a question later. They can say, oh, I just thought of something to say about that thing you asked me earlier. It's not a sign of failure at all for someone to take quiet time or to say, I don't know, and come back to it. You can just get the candidate talking about anything job related and then begin to guide them into the more behavioral components of where you want the interview to go. So if they get frozen by these kinds of questions and they're like, I don't know how to answer this, I can't do this. Follow their cues. Just tell me more about this. Describe a typical day on the job and what kinds of things that you did. What was hard about that job for you? And how did you learn that? How did you learn to do what you had to do there? And so there's things you can do that everybody can answer that begins to shift them into that behavioral based mode. And once people are in it, then it comes more spontaneously for them. Again, we're not looking to trip people up with this interview technique, but we are looking to clarify the difference between a good BS job and someone who actually has a lived experience of demonstrating some of these skills. So it's also always important as you're doing this interview technique that you follow open-ended questions. Tell me more about something with more specific probes so that you're not just abandoning the interview to them, but that you're directing it in very specific ways. I also want you to think about, once you've designed specific behavioral-based questions, how would you go about structuring a whole conversation? Then how would you put this together? So if we're going to imagine, Monica had raised the question earlier about, should I use the traditional interview format for my preliminary interviews? Maybe I'm doing all of those on Zoom or doing them on the phone. I'm perfectly okay with doing that. I think that makes a lot of sense to get my pool assembled. But now I've got people coming in for interviews. How would I imagine a 1-hour conversation with a person? Now, I'm not saying every candidate for every job should have a 1-hour interview. I'm saying if you had a 60-minute conversation, how would then you structure it? I would structure it so that there's some pretty easy questions to field for the first 5 minutes or so of that interview. And those might be more traditional based interview questions. They may be more geared towards candidates talking about things that make them comfortable so that they kind of settle in. And then that you would take a full 45 minutes of that interview to do a combination of those traditional based questions and the behavioral based questions that you would have designed ahead of time. The key here is that 45 minutes out of that hour interview ought to be you directing the flow of the conversation, not kind of I remember one interview I had once. It was actually when I first went to work for the Alban Institute, is when I was interviewing for that job. A really key person in that organization, I won't name names. I came into their office and I sat down in the chair and they said, I don't really know anything about you and I don't know a lot about the job you're interviewing for. So just tell me about yourself. And that was the whole interview. I had to run the interview as the candidate. I don't know what the purpose of that was, but it certainly didn't set that interviewer up for exploring anything with me. I mean, we just were talking about random stuff for an hour, and apparently it went well enough because I got the job, but that's not a good interview format, right? As the interviewer, I should take the role of shaping and forming how this interview unfolds. And then I should allow a specific period of time for the candidate to ask me questions. But the mix in an hour interview would be about 45 minutes of me driving the bus, so to speak, and 10 minutes of them. And I think it's important to give them that 10 minutes because it's also very telling to me if a candidate has no questions. Okay, everybody should be able to come up with some questions now that they've heard me pose questions to them about what this job is. If they have zero questions about what this job is, that should be a flag for me. And then in the final 5 minutes, I would be outlining next steps for them. So a key mistake that you can make in an interview process is to let the person leave the interview with lack of clarity about what happens next or how long they can expect to wait to hear from me. You can lose really good candidates by not doing step number 4, right? If someone says, I don't know how that went, I haven't heard anything in a couple of weeks, I don't know if that's good or bad, I'm going elsewhere. Okay. If you know it's going to be a few weeks before you do the next part of your process, just tell them that this is what we're doing. This is why you won't hear from me, or you can expect to hear something back from me in the next 48 hours, whatever it is. How is this unfolding from here on out? Now, a word about checking references. Reference checks rarely tell you if you've hired the right person, but they can tell you if you're hiring the wrong person. They can raise a flag and let you know this person's job performance someplace else was hugely problematic. And one of the big problems that many of us make, or the mistakes we make relative to references, is we decide to make this the last step in our process. So we create this pool, we narrow the pool down, we get the pool to the point where it's like, this is the person we really want to hire. Now we'll check their references. The problem is that you've already fallen in love with that candidate. You've already decided this is my candidate, and that is going to show when you do your reference checks. So this is the person who calls me up for a reference check and says, don't you just love this person? We just love this person. Is there anything that you need to tell me before I hire them? Well, I'm going to really rein myself in there, knowing they've already fallen in love with this person. They want to hire them. There's nothing that I can really share there. Okay. So moving the reference check up a little earlier in the process, it's very time consuming to do background checks or reference checks for every candidate in your pool. You don't want to do that. But when you're narrowing the pool and assuming you still have 2 or 3 candidates left, that's the time to do it before you actually make your final decision. Now, the question always comes up, so many people won't really give a reference check anymore because of all the legalities of saying something bad about a person. And that's true. There are a lot of places, particularly in corporate environments, where the policy is we don't say anything other than verify employment dates and what role the person had. And if you get one of those, there's not much that you can do about that. But I have found that in church environments, most people actually do want to tell you something. Even if they have a policy of, I'm not going to really tell you much about this, that if you are, if you craft some good questions, you can get them to talk a little bit. Or the other critical thing is that it's really important that you pay attention to what they're not saying, or that you figure out how to read between the lines. My favorite ridiculous example of this was one that somebody shared with me last year, where they were doing reference checks of a director level job. And the person wouldn't answer any questions. And they were really the reference check was not really answering any questions. But what the person kept saying was every time they asked a question, they'd say, Frank makes a great bouillabaisse. And you really ought to ask him to cook for you because he's just a phenomenal cook. Cooking had nothing to do with the position that Frank was interviewing for. And every time the person who was doing the reference check kept trying to come back around to that, the person just went back into, but don't forget that Frank makes a great bouillabaisse. So the person was clearly evading saying anything, but wanted to communicate that something was off, right? And the way that they communicated it was with this ridiculous response. Now, I'm not advocating that you all go out and start giving ridiculous responses when people do reference checks with you. But what I am advocating is that you listen and read between the lines, because people are often trying to communicate a reticence about something, but they feel like legally it might get them into trouble. And this is why it's important to have not decided so you can read between the lines, right? So if you have access to the book When Moses Meets Aaron that Gil Rendell and I spoke about, there's a whole page in that book in the chapter on hiring for good reference questions, ways to ask questions to try to get more deeply into someone's head about their employment experience, and to encourage people to keep talking. And I think a great question is always to ask, would you hire this person again if given the chance? Almost everybody will answer that question on some level. They'll say something like, well, we don't have that position anymore. But if you did, would you hire Frank back? Well, and if they start trying to talk all the way around it, it's an indicator to you that there was something amiss there. You may never get to the essence of what it was, but you'll get to something is off in Frank's relationship with his employer, and you can come back to Frank and ask more questions about that as well. Or the person may just say, this person was just phenomenal with us, and if I had the opportunity to hire again, I would. Well, that's what I want to hear, right? A couple of words about avoiding unintentional discrimination, and then we'll open ourselves up again to Q&A. So if you've got a question that's brewing out there in your mind, go ahead and get that in the chat. But none of us wants to discriminate intentionally as we're in a hiring process, but it's very easy to get ourselves sidestepped into asking questions that either are not legal or not ethical in terms of the position we put a candidate in. So to avoid doing that, it is important that you not ask off-the-cuff questions. Now, I'm not saying you can never vary your script. As I said earlier, you should have a script of questions, and then you should feel free to follow up on the questions that you ask with prompts. What you should avoid doing is just randomly coming up with questions based on what's striking you in the moment. Keep the format of the questions consistent between candidates. Okay, so I'm going to ask everybody about decision-making, but I ask this person one way, I ask that person another way. Again, if you design your interview questions ahead of time, you'll head that one off at the pass. Only ask questions if they're related to the essential functions of the job or the core competencies of the defined position, right? So if, and this is again where the halo effect kind of comes back in, like we have a hunch about a person or something that we're attracted to or something that we're repulsed by, and we just start asking questions related to the thing that we're drawn to or the thing that makes us uncomfortable, and those things actually have nothing to do with the position. So, so for example, I, as a female interviewer, may all of a sudden get hooked by something that a female candidate says about how she was discriminated against, and I want to listen to her about that, and I want to talk about that a little bit more and resonate about that. But it has nothing to do with the essential functions of this position or the core competencies. So if I allow myself to go down that rabbit hole, then I might start getting into some of my own unintentional discrimination. It's really important that you focus on the ability to perform those functions and those competencies, not on any apparent disabilities to you. So for example, let's say I'm sitting in my office waiting for a candidate to show up, and I look out my window to the street in front of the church and I see the candidate gets off the bus, okay? And I realize that this is a person who took the bus to the interview, but I'm living in a suburban location, and now all of a sudden I have some flags in my head about, you know, is the bus the most reliable way for, we don't have a lot of public transportation out here. Like, how far did this person have to travel on this bus? How far do they have to walk? Is this going to be a problem? I cannot ask those questions. That's discriminatory. What I can talk about is the competency we have about attention to start and stop times. You know, that we have policies here about how we work together and when we show up, and you know, and to ask them what their prior experiences are in their own life and being in workplaces where being on time was important, because that's a competency of this job. I can't go into conversations about, don't you have a car and do you need one? And are you planning on taking the bus every day? If the person is demonstrating to me that they have ability to get to this job on time and be here on time and do the job, then that should be sufficient for me. Similarly, if a woman walks in and she's obviously pregnant, and I'm worried because she's applying for a bookkeeper role, and in her bookkeeper role, we're coming up on year end, and I can see from the size of her stomach that she may have this baby before year end, and how are we going to get the books closed? It's not legal for me to talk to her about her pregnancy. What I can talk about is the pressure of the year-end closing of books, and to talk about the competency of the job related to that, and to ask her about how she's handled pressure like that around the year-end closing of the books in her past, and get her talking about that. But I cannot inquire directly about the thing that appears to me to be a disability, right? Talk about the essential functions, talk about the core competencies, their experiences on delivering essential functions and core competencies in previous experiences. And then the other critical thing is prepare all your interviewers, right? So if you're going to have 4 or 5 people interviewing a candidate about a position, or 2 or 3, and a couple of them are lay leaders who don't have a lot of personnel background, you cannot make assumptions that people are going to know how to do this interviewing. right? Together, you have to decide these are the questions we're asking. These are the people asking the questions. Some people choose to ask every candidate all the same questions, right? And divide those questions, and repeat those same questions in different contexts, because we want to see, how did they answer that question for me? How did they answer that question for the young male that was sitting in the next room talking about them? I can tell some things about that. Other people decide, well, we've got a bank of questions we want to ask, and we're going to divide them up, and I'm going to take these 5, and you're going to take those 7, and you're going to take those 6. And then we'll get back together and compare notes afterwards. But be intentional about preparing your interviewers for the work that you want them to do. And finally, again, just remember what the goal of this whole process is. We're here because we're trying to hire the person who's the best fit for this position. We're trying to find the right person for this job, which is not the same as hiring the best interviewer. Okay, we want to look beneath the surface of how well and crafty and charismatic they are in the interview to say, what is the evidence that they can actually do the job? And then we're designing an interview process that reveals that true fit. Okay. So let's head on back over to some more Q&A, and I'm going to invite Kathleen back on to either invite you up with your questions or to field those questions on our behalf.
Amy Melina Moore had a question about closing interviews.
Okay.
This is just a curiosity. Are there some positions where it's weird to open and close in prayer?
I don't think so. So what you want to be careful about is, what is the position, and what is our context for how we use prayer, right? So if your expectation is that every member of my staff team actually needs to be comfortable with prayer because we engage in prayer in staff meetings all the time, right? Then I would bring that into the interview. If, on the other hand, you're a workplace where, my bookkeeper doesn't need to be a Christian, doesn't need to share any of our beliefs, and isn't going to be in staff meetings where we're going to have to figure out if they're comfortable with that or not, then I probably wouldn't, right? But it certainly seems like most clergy and director level positions, it feels like it would be appropriate, because people are going to be in environments in the church where that is something they should be comfortable with.
And Paula Clark has a question about references.
Paula, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. It took a second for me to get it up.
Yeah.
So people provide you the references. Of course, the references people
Yeah.
provide are the people who love them the most. So
Right.
I was wondering, is it one of your recommendations that you go beyond those that they have initially, when you ask for references, is it okay for you to go back and say, provide, depending on the position, of course, provide me a name of someone who you've worked closely with, someone who has supervised you, someone who you've supervised, something like that. Is that
Yeah.
fair game, and is that helpful?
Yeah, good question, Paula. So I'll answer that, but then Kathleen or anybody else on staff who's got a lot of HR background that wants to chime in, I welcome that. First of all, I wouldn't assume that because somebody gave you the names, they're going to be good references. I have been amazed at the number of times I've been asked to serve as a reference, and I'm like, why in the world would this person ask me to be a reference? I don't even know what a good thing I could say about this, or I hardly know them, or why would they be asking me, right? And so follow up on those references, because sometimes they do tell you surprising things. And I do think it's appropriate, if you feel like the reference list has not been robust enough, to go back to the person and say, I want to talk to someone who's got these characteristics, right? Someone you worked side by, because they may have legitimate reasons for why they haven't. I'm not ready to tell my current employer, so I don't want anybody from my current workplace, or I don't, and then you can decide how much you want to push back on that and say, no, we really do need to talk with someone that you've worked directly with. That's going to, but then the third category so I think that is appropriate to do that. Then the third category are people that you may know who may know this person. And that happens a lot in the world of church, right? So you've never met this person before, but they, for example, they worked with somebody else on this call. It's on this in this webinar. Pick up the phone and call that person, even if they're not a reference check, and say, hey, we're looking at this person. I just want to ask you some questions about, do you know them? What do you know about them? Of course, you want to be sensitive to the person who's told me clearly that they're not ready to tell their employer that they're potentially leaving. I'm not going to call their boss on my own without permission to do that. That's just not ethical, right?
Yeah.
But if you have connections and you're pretty sure that you can talk to somebody and that it's not going to get back to their current employer, somebody who supervised this person 2 jobs ago, pick up the phone, call them, let them know, this is just between you and I at this point. But Kathleen, do you have anything else to add to that based on your experience?
No,
Okay.
I think
All
that covers it.
All right.
Okay. Next up is a question from Joshua.
Joshua, you're still muted.
Joshua Daniel. You may have had to go.
You can't unmute.
There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah, I was wondering about I love the behavioral approach to interviews, about like trying to get to like the real stuff that you're wanting these people to actually do for you.
Yeah.
And so often in the church, like you're wanting good, wise judgment, and that's really hard to assess on questions that you were just given. So is there a way to kind of both get the kind of knee-jerk authentic reaction, but also to this much harder thing that might require, anyway, that's my question.
I do think that that's where the probing follow-up questions come in, and where it also comes in your own mental setup for behavioral based interviewing, that you're not looking for people giving really snappy, clever answers. You're looking for people to talk about real experiences, and you're giving them permission to do that. So if they give you a really kind of messy, half-formed answer, that's actually the ideal thing you want to hear, right? Well, so tell me more about that. That had to be really awkward, and they start telling you things that they hadn't planned to talk to you about, because the probing questions take them further into that. So you're not going to get, what you're not looking for is stellar polished answers. That's never what you want. Okay. What you want is somebody talking as authentically as they can about the experience they had, what was good about that, what was not good about that, how they, the key thing I want to find out is, how did you grow and learn through that? Right. So I can even ask the follow-up question. So if you had to do that again, what would you do differently the second time? Now I'm inviting them into their polished selves, right? Now you can tell me about, well, this is what a real person should do in that circumstance. Is that, get at what you were talking about, Joshua? All right.
Great. And just one thing, sometimes it's good to leave the door open with a primary reference, so that after like a final interview, you're able to call back. And if something has come up about judgment, or you're able to follow up in greater detail.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll think more about what they want to say to you too, if you leave the door open, right? Like the first conversation was the real fluff conversation, but when they know you're serious about it, they'll come back and tell you more.
Next question is from Monica Manwaring, and it's about using outside firms for recruitment.
Yeah. So, I think more and more, even at the clergy level, some people are doing that. I haven't run into this in the Episcopal Church yet, but it could be happening, right? But in other denominations I've been in, people are using search firms for clergy candidates when they know they have to do a national search and they can't just rely on their own local setting. People also use outside firms to help validate the skill set of someone who needs, so for example, let's say I'm hiring an IT person or an operations person who has to, take care of all our computers. And I have no way of assessing whether they know what they need to know. Or I'm hiring somebody for an administrative role and they have to have skills in programs and things I'm just not familiar with, our communications director. that there are outside agencies you can use to actually test and validate skills that you're looking for. And so people are doing more and more of that, and I think that's appropriate. Monica, did you have something more specific there you wanted to ask about?
I actually was interested in if I myself have my eyes on a candidate that I want to go pursue.
Yes.
Do I need to run a whole process and interview different people? Or is there ever an instance in which you can kind of just go pursue your candidate and hire them if it works out?
Yeah, I think people do that all the time, right? I think, people say, I know what I'm looking for. I know this person has those skills. I would just encourage you, when you're going to do that, to still go through the discipline of running a process with them, right? Just don't go to them and say, I've got a job. I think you're right for the job. Are you interested? Go to them and say, I've got a job. I have a suspicion you're the right candidate. Would you be open to going through a process with us to explore that? So that you create the dynamic of this person is actually going to go through fairly rigorous, we are going to stop first and get the job description and get clear about things. And they're going to go through a fairly rigorous interview process before we make that decision. You don't want to lead off with, the job is yours if you're interested, right? I was actually in that position once before, and it actually wasn't a fun interview process to go through, because it felt like the whole thing was in my lap. Like I was trying to figure out when the interview process was enough to warrant us all saying yes. You don't want to put a person in that position either. You're always in the driver's seat on this thing. But yeah, so if you're fairly certain you know what you want, then going through the kind of sham of developing a pool of candidates so that you have a pretend pool of candidates to evaluate this person against, that feels like a huge waste of energy. Unless you're not sure. Yeah, I think this person might be right, but I'm going to encourage them to put their name in the pool, but we are going to look at some other people too. Okay.
Kristen Mills.
Yeah, thank you. So we hired a parish administrator this summer, and that's a job that can be done remotely. And I still found it to be a minefield trying to talk open and honestly about whether that job would be in person or remote, and thinking through if we have to hire someone, like say we're having in-person services and we need to hire or whatever position, how to navigate those conversations without discrimination right now during the pandemic, especially because like normally if someone can do the job without any accommodations right now, that might be different. And so how to hire people during a pandemic without stepping in any legality, or just how to have those conversations.
Yeah. I think, well, you're introducing the complexity of dealing with a potential disability that's not a disability in one environment that might be in another. But I think it's even a bigger question than that. I think all of the hiring we're doing right now has that same underlying current. What are these jobs going to look like on the other side of no pandemic or a handled pandemic? And we're going to find that church is remarkably different on the other side of this. Some things are coming back, some things are not coming back, some things are going to morph. So I'm not trying to sidestep your question. I'm just saying it's a real question that applies to all the hiring we're doing right now, that we need to signal to people as we're hiring that our intent is that this is a long-term position. And our intent in this moment is that you can do this, that your presence is going to be a remote presence. But we need to bear in mind that on the other side of this, the job is going to change. And so as it changes on the other side of this, we may all have to revisit what the core competencies and essential functions of the job are. We just have to be honest about that. And that's true of our jobs. Each one of us here, right, may find on the other side of this that we're not capable for what's going to be called forth from us in the next chapter. So I think just some real clarity of communication around that, and of saying, without being discriminatory, of just saying this is what the job is now. I'm not sure what the job is on the other side of this, and we may have to revisit this. Does that help with that question? Kristen? Okay.
Great. Next, Todd Thomas.
So I was just mentioning that we talked about in our small group, hiring in the secular world. My experience both as an interviewee and an interviewer, we often began with groups of participants, and it really made the behavioral questions really rich at times as the groups worked together. And in fact, as we hired someone or someones, that may be a 4 to 5 interview process, and 2 to 3 of those would be in groups. It was quite a while before you did individual interviews. And I was just kind of wondering if we could bring that into our hiring realm in the church more.
You mean that the group of, is a group of candidates or a group of interviewers?
Group of candidates.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. I was involved in that kind of interview process in the in the automaker industry, you know, where people came through in groups and performed tasks and did those kinds of things ahead of time. It's hard for me to visualize what that would look like in the world of church. So I guess I don't know what to say about that quite, Todd. I don't know. I wouldn't say no, but it's just hard for me to imagine. In those circumstances where I saw that happen, there were huge volumes of potential candidates that all had comparable kinds of skills. In most of the hiring we do in congregations, we're not starting out with huge pools of candidates, and they all have some very different kinds of skills. So I don't know if that would impact it or not. Do you have more you want to say about that, Todd? In terms of how you think it would work?
Well, I think position to position, it might be different. We were just reflecting on, you know, we do that when we elect bishops. We actually have them in groups taking questions together and things like that. And we reflected on, you know, for me, we interviewed a lot, and we had pools of interviewees even for promotions within the company. This was at Apple. And
okay.
So yeah, sometimes these were large groups of people and pools of candidates. Yep. Sometimes it was 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Sometimes we would hire all, sometimes we were only hiring one. But it forged some interesting relationships between myself and other people who did or didn't get the job.
Yeah.
They have today.
Again, I would say some of that comes back to what are the competencies of the position that you're hiring for? And is this reflective of a competency? So when you're talking about Apple, you're talking about an environment where people are expected to be pretty wildly creative and think on their feet and function well in high pressured kind of team situations, so that's a fair thing. If I'm hiring somebody to clean my building, their ability to negotiate their way through a group conversation with multiple other people is not one of the competencies of the job. So I think it always comes back to what are the competencies and how do I design an interview that replicates the competency I'm trying to get at.
Thanks. Next question is from Martin Coe. Actually, it's just an interesting anecdote.
Okay, Martin, share your anecdote. Is Martin still here?
I am.
Okay.
No, it was just a note, because we're talking about testing competencies and things. It was just actually, it's happened to me a couple of times when appointing admin team to say, well, you know, the task you need to do is in the folder on the laptop, and it's surprising how many folk who've told me that they're really good at office skills can't actually search the laptop for the folder that the task is in.
That's an example of having them do part of the job, right? Yes. You know, I need you to set up this Excel spreadsheet to do this, and you've got 45 minutes to do it, or whatever, do it on this computer and show it to me. Yeah, or open the file folder. All right.
Comment from Anna Broadbent to everyone in response to Todd's.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was hired for my current position through a group interview. I had an individual interview actually for my first interview, and they used all of those to narrow down to 4 candidates, and we were all kind of flown, I guess, sort of like the sort of like a bishop's walkabout kind of, but we were hosted for an entire weekend. The weekend included, multiple interviews, kind of group. Most of those were not as a large group, but lots of social situations where we were all together. And then I had interviews with staff, with different stakeholders in the church, with my current boss, who is from the Church of England. And so apparently that's a very common practice in the way that he's used to doing that. Yeah. I personally found it very enriching and enjoyable. I think for us, the Episcopal Church is small, so I knew 2 of the 3 other candidates already and had relationships with them. So I thought it was a pleasant process personally.
Well, the other place, Anna, now that you've mentioned that, Todd, the other place that I've seen that done pretty effectively is in hiring interns.
Yeah.
Right, where a whole pool of students come through together. But we know we're going to hire 3 of you out of this pool of 10. And so they go through a group process, as we narrow that down. So.
Okay. And there was also an affirmation from Sue von Rottenkrantz of a similar circumstance.
Yeah, it was in an interview process in the Diocese of Ohio with 2 other finalists. And it was a combination of group interview as well as individual interviews. The interviews with the bishop were all individual, but then we would be in groups with a certain person for one aspect of the position and another person for another aspect of the position. I found it really wonderful. I met the person who actually got the job is somebody I had known before, but it was a great experience of interchanging ideas about how we might do things differently. And I think in some instances when you're working with a team approach, especially, which is what they were trying to do, I found it really helpful to do it in that way.
Yeah, they're trying to replicate your ability to work as a team and to be collaborative. And yeah, excellent examples. Thank you. Thanks for that rich conversation. And I recognize we're going to need to wrap this up. People are already dropping off really quickly. So let's just kind of draw a conclusion to today. Thanks again for your time and attention. Next week when we come back, we're really talking about the guts of what a lot of you may have signed up for this course from in the first place. I just have to get rid of this person off my staff team. How do I do this well? And so I think it'll be a rich dialogue. It'll be a full conversation. So look forward to being with you next week for our final week together. Thanks, everybody.